Greetings, friends. Welcome back to the bottom shelf. In the United States, we have a storied Christian tradition going back to the fanciful stories we tell about our founding. A group of persecuted European pilgrims arriving at Plymouth Rock and establishing colonies that would become our country. That Christianity, overtly Protestant and militantly individualist, wields a powerful amount of influence and control over daily events and attitudes inside the states. Every Sunday, like clockwork, whether via Zoom meeting, drive-in, or seated well-dressed in pews, Americans flock to their local churches to commune, worship, and generally feel welcomed as part of a religious community. However, as the 21st century has proceeded, American Christianity is wrought by a crisis. Not of faith, but of the departing faithful who are abandoning their parents' churches in large and increasing numbers. The frequently conservative, occasionally oppressive churches of the United States are the perpetrators of several dangerous ideologies, including the prosperity gospel and whatever Westboro Baptist is saying right now at a gay man's funeral somewhere. But to paint the totality of the Christian religion as it's practiced in the United States with such a broad and harsh brush does it a grand disservice. The teachings and wisdom of Jesus Christ of Nazareth do possess moral worth and value, and there are tens of thousands of Christians who are moved by his wisdom to perform acts of unending kindness and self-sacrifice, including but not limited to taking to the streets in protest of the brutal police slayings of Black Americans. Today, I want to talk not about the prosperity gospel hucksters, hypocrites, and grifters. I want to talk about what I feel is the most endangered species of American Christian, the Christian progressive. Today, I'm joined by one, Preacher Man 9000, sports enthusiast, David Simon disciple, Kurt Sutter fan, a dear friend to me personally, and actual pastor of Protestant Christianity. I welcome you to the bottom shelf. I certainly expect we're about to elevate the kind of conversation we have on this show to a new level. And as always, is there anything about yourself that you would like to say before we begin that I may have missed?
Thank you for having me on, Nexus. I do feel like an endangered species sometimes, and I'm hoping we'll get to talk about kind of where progressive Christianity is and why it's not really talked about on the news very often.
We really need to. It's kind of important right now. And I guess the best place to start will be to talk about your own progressive beliefs and influences. If you want, we can start with the gospel and go outside of it. Do you have any thoughts as to the current levels of unrest and political polarization in our country right now?
Well, I think from just a personal perspective, and it is influenced by my Christianity, but we see a lot of divide and not a lot of coming together. And so in our country right now, you even see it with the pandemic where people are debating on whether a mask is worth wearing or not. So if my gospel, if my understanding of this world is to love my neighbor, I'm going to wear a mask for them. And that is going to shape how I view the world that's happening around me.
Absolutely. Wearing the mask it's inconvenient, but it's essentially a sacrifice of convenience to show that you love your neighbor, to practice the gospel in it's really in a very active way.
Yeah. And
do you think that there's this weird
just having...
Oh, I'm sorry. I must have lagged for a moment.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was going to...
You go ahead.
I was just saying that it seems strange to me that the right wing and the Trump Republicans want to claim the banner of Protestant Christianity. They want to wave that flag, but without actually practicing the teachings.
Yeah, and I think that there are some political motivations that supersede the and I'm gonna brush broadly here, but know that it's more nuanced than this.
Of course.
So basically, if the political answer is don't take away my freedom, that is an American idealism very much felt by the right wing.
Absolutely.
So you can justify not wearing a mask because that's your freedom by also telling that being kind to others does not include people who you have taken outside of your inner circle, if you will. So if you've come to the point where, let's just say that a black life does not matter as much as a white life, then you can come to that conclusion where you're still loving your neighbor, but you've decided who your neighbor is. I would like to turn them all to the parable of the Good Samaritan,
Yes.
and remind them that's exactly what is being taught in the Gospel of Luke, because the Samaritans' lives didn't matter to the Jewish people at the time.
Really?
Yeah. A Samaritan, and I'll do this real briefly.
Go for it.
Basically, a Samaritan was a northern Israelite who had been crossbred from the Assyrian Empire. And so they were in political opposition to the Jewish people of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus.
And the
so
rhetoric.
Jesus was telling them, when we say you should love thy neighbor from the Torah, that it was assumed that just meant loving my Jewish neighbor. If you're inside our clan, I love you. But Jesus was saying, look at those who are outside of the clan and love them also.
Excellent. Okay. So there's a tribalist element to it, definitely.
Yes, very much so.
Okay, I think that's important to acknowledge that in the United States, especially in the 21st century, we seem to be living less like the communes and communities that existed religiously or otherwise in the 17th and 18th centuries while we were in our founding period. There seems to have been some differences, at least, that we've changed in so much as our suburbs are islands. Our suburban homes are islands. We leave the island to commune and go shopping and attend the ceremonies, but many of us have leave the teachings at the floor, per se, when we leave.
Yeah, and I think especially those two times that you just mentioned. So in the time of early Christianity, first century, and the 16th and 17th century, when religious persecution, people were fleeing Europe to come here to have religious freedom, which we can get into what that actually means, because it doesn't mean the same thing that it means today. Both of those groups were minority factions. Whereas now the rhetoric of the minority has been co-opted by a group of majority Christians to continue their majority opinion, whereas they were written for an oppressed people trying to give themselves hope in a new life, a new world, a new religion.
Fascinating.
And so you don't have to teach the Good Samaritan as it was intended if the goal is for us to forget who the Samaritans were, and that we're not trying to tell you to be good. We're trying to tell you to believe what we say. And so that paints a different picture theologically than you would if you are coming at it from a historical perspective, or from a historical perspective.
That makes perfect sense, because the history in the United States, as you mentioned, is fraught with its own forms of persecution. And it seemed that many of the various factions within American Christianity often disagreed about how best to carry out the theology and the message.
Oh, absolutely. Our Protestant upbringing in this country was very much came out of some of the unintended consequences of the Reformation. So over, what I would deem as a genuine disagreement in enough theological categories that it made sense to separate.
Yeah.
Then you had an onslaught of, well, we agree, Luther put 95 theses up. So this other guy comes in and says, well, I agree with 94, but this one, I don't agree with that one. So we're over here. And, then it got where I think it was Henry VIII. You might have to fact check me on that one. The one that started the Anglican Church. And that was all because the Pope wouldn't give him an annulment for his wife, who wouldn't. I say wouldn't sarcastically because it was all over having a male heir, and at that time they thought it was her fault. And if we talk to our scientists right now, that we know whose fault that was.
Indeed.
So what you have is this system of trying to be, in charge of land and of theology, and groups got marginalized, and then there was all this essentially, and again, this is a little tongue-in-cheek, but from their perspective, essentially a bunch of free land became available.
Indeed.
And it's a lot easier to rule over land that you have already deemed yours than to try to go take somebody else's. And I say it that way because if you hear what I just said there, you would not realize that it's easier to conquer America that already has people on it than to conquer Europe that already has people on it.
Yes, and this can partially be explained due to the native peoples of America's lack of understanding of property and the notion that the various tribes existed in essentially loose confederation with one another and migrated around frequently. I can't emphasize enough, Native Americans did not understand the concept of this is my land. I put up these stakes. This little border is my sovereign state, the state of Nexus. The Native Americans just didn't get that. They didn't conceive of ownership.
They had a much more spiritual relationship with the land than a ownership relationship with the land. So they didn't understand, and rightfully so, because culture, when white people showed up and said, no, if it's inside this fence, it's now mine.
Yeah.
And so coming out of that, then you've got all these groups that are saying, well, this is my form of Protestant Christianity, and I like it, in Massachusetts, and Rhode Island has its own, and, so on and so forth. As you get farther south, it's a lot more economic reasons for colonies, but mostly in the Northeast, it's, you've got different kind of fashions of what are essentially, is a Protestant Christianity that if you dropped an alien into them, they wouldn't be able to tell the difference between.
That makes perfect sense, and that brings me to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is the imperialism of European Protestantism. How the folks who came over here were able to use the scriptures to justify the chattel slavery of African Americans? Because that's not something that I understand. I've been reading books about the violence that undergoes life in Edgefield, South Carolina in 1760, for example, when the roaming militias are roaming around looking for, oh, are you a Tory loyalist? Well, we're colonials, we're gonna fuck you up. Or you're a colonial, we're Tories and you're colonials and we're gonna mess you up. Like this tribalism, definitely it seems like we've never left it, that it's really still with us, and we've found religious excuses to justify our treatment of African Americans, at least at the time we did. We used those scriptural excuses, almost all of which I'm certain are Old Testament.
I'm gonna blow your mind to say that they are not.
Oh my gosh. Consider my mind blown, boss.
I'll get you there. You just let me know when you want to go.
Well, you've got me.
Okay.
Hit me with the justification from the New Testament.
All right. So wander with me on a journey here.
Let's
We're gonna go a little fast, so I will urge the audience that if you need to repeat me, I'll pause at the end of each jump, and you can go back and watch it again.
There you go.
Okay. So in reading the Bible, American Protestant Christianity of the
I am
that
lagging.
they were going to read the Bible as if it had been written for them and only for them, but also for, that the same people who read it when it was written wrote it. But when you are talking about the Bible in the 18th century, if I am an 18th century white man reading it, that God has voiced that to me throughout the ages.
Yes.
And what ends up happening with that is then certain context is taken away. So you have a verse such as, let slaves be servants to their master. So you have that. That's a New Testament scripture. Basically, and I'll back up here for a second. So that verse is for a Greek society that has a different view of slavery. It still has slavery, obviously, but it has a different view of slavery than 18th century America does. And so pulling that verse out and saying, oh, well, my God now wants me to have this new form of slave, because it says it right here in the book. Now, a couple books before it in the same New Testament, it says no slave, no free. So, it contradicts itself. But of course, we like, when we're oppressing people, we like the ones that work for us.
Yeah, we like to cherry pick. We want it to be as clear and concise as possible, to the point where we can just point to this 7 or 8 word phrase from the scriptures and just put our flag in it and go, there it is, boom, that's my hill.
And so it's that, and I mean, we still see that is the way that the Bible is still read today, just a little bit more covertly. Now, and we can get into it, that I have a different way that I read the scripture, and progressive Christianity will read it that, contends against that reading.
Naturally.
But but that is the system in which your Bible thumper white preachers gave heavenly permission for the corruption of slavery.
And I'm sure subsequently the greed of corporatist capitalism.
Yeah, and
I'm imagining this
document.
I'm imagining this kind of sense of ownership by divine right. I don't know how far off I am with that.
Oh yeah, they definitely would have subscribed to a divine right the same way as a European monarch thought that they were ordained by God to be the one ruler. It's that same mentality that gets you into a we're going to set our world that we want it, and we're going to believe, and I'm sure that they rightfully did believe this,
Yes.
that our God is okay with the actions that we are currently doing.
And I guess we can kind of extend that now to foreign policy.
Ooh, that you're gonna get me into Revelation if you start talking foreign policy, buddy.
Well, I do understand that you have a Vox clip that you wanted me to investigate.
Oh yes, I think this is so for your audience before you play this. So this is a clip that explains why conservatism needs Israel, not for Israel's sake, but for their own sake.
Very interesting. All right. For the audience reactionary purposes, I have not actually seen this before. This will be my first viewing. So my reaction will be raw. Let us begin.
There's a church in the city of Bethlehem. It was built on the spot where Christians believe Jesus was born. It's called the Church of the Nativity.
Okay.
If you consult UNESCO's list of World Heritage Sites or ask travel expert Rick Steves, both will tell you that the church is in Palestine. But when a question about the church's location came up during a round of Jeopardy in January 2020,
built in the 300s AD, the Church of the Nativity.
What is Palestine?
No.
What is Israel?
That's it.
that answer set off something of an internet firestorm.
Oh, shots fired. Oh, buffering time.
That's because what you call this land, and who controls it, is at the center of a decades-long conflict between Israelis and
Of course.
Palestinians. But more recently, there is also a third group that is becoming more and more influential here and throughout the Middle East.
Let me guess.
American evangelical
Yeah, I
Christians.
knew it.
Today, evangelical Christians are one of the most politically powerful voting blocs in the United States.
That's our
And
Trump.
in the
He's our
Trump
guy.
administration, They've been given unprecedented power.
No,
They
that's
turned
their
support
guy.
for
Oh,
Israel
of course,
and
you're right.
hostility
Mike
towards its
Pence,
enemies
definitely.
into core tenets of conservative ideology. And a big
The other one's a
part of those
means to an end.
policies is rooted
Truth.
in how they interpret the Bible.
Here we are. Let's see. How do they interpret
In
the Bible
2016,
box?
more than a quarter of all U.S. voters identified as white evangelical Christians. One of the primary differences
There were a
between
lot of non-voters in
evangelicals and other
2016.
Christians is their relationship with the Bible.
Conservative evangelicals believe that the Bible is literally true.
Sarah Posner writes about religion for a bunch of different publications.
Many of them believe that the Bible is sort of this prophetic roadmap for modern life, that events described and prophesied
Intriguing.
in the Bible will become true.
The Bible
Aha,
is
the
most
prophecies.
historically
Yes,
accurate book
here we
ever.
go.
The Bible is the one book that dares to predict the future with 100% accuracy.
For evangelicals, the most important of the Bible's prophecies is the second coming, when Jesus will return to earth. The Bible doesn't say
Of course.
when this will happen, but it does say where.
This is Jerusalem. World history as we know it is going to end right here.
Greg Laurie is an evangelical preacher, one of several who meet regularly to advise President Trump. They are the leaders of megachurches with tens of thousands of members. And many of them, including Greg Laurie, preach a belief called Christian Zionism. The idea that the return of the Jewish people to Israel is one of a series of events that will trigger Jesus' second coming.
Jesus is telling us that the rebirth of Israel is a sign of the end, not just a sign, It's the super sign.
According to this theology, God will reward those who help Israel and punish those who don't.
Jesus will be on his throne and he separates the nations. On what basis?
It's
How they
Crazy Witch
treated
Woman, my
Zion.
favorite.
Let's back up. After the Holocaust, the UN divided up the then British territory of Palestine, home to more than 1 million Arabs, into 2 states, giving Jews who had been persecuted in Europe a homeland. Over the next few decades, Israel fought multiple wars with its Arab neighbors and seized much of the land that had been originally set
Yeah,
aside
in
for
2020, this
Palestinians.
is what it looks like now.
Evangelical Christians see that as a fulfillment
Okay.
of biblical prophecy.
It happened exactly as foretold. It was a miraculous act of God.
They own that land and they own that
Ooh, hold on a minute. We have to talk about that symbol in the background. Ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who do not recognize the iron eagle, perfectly symmetrical, often used as a symbol of government authority in some capacity, and a favorite of the iconography of Hitler's Third Reich. Very interesting background choice for a religious service, I must admit.
own that land and they own that
That's not even the scariest thing in that clip.
Ever since, groups like
You're
Hamas
right.
have been fighting against the Israelis,
But
trying
that's
to
also
win that
scary.
territory back.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And the government of Iran has been one of their biggest
So are these
supporters.
gun-toting militias. They'll scare anybody. The Zionist regime is a dried and rotten tree that will be destroyed by a single storm.
That's part of the reason Iran plays such an important role in evangelical beliefs about the present state of the world and the future. According to Christian Zionism, if the US wants to be on the right side of biblical prophecy, they need to do everything possible to protect Israel and punish Iran. That also helps explain
Well,
why a different Bible story is also really
That
important.
explains the assassination of
The Old
Qasem
Testament story of
Soleimani.
Esther, about a plot to destroy the Jews of Persia, or modern-day
And we can
Iran.
talk about the Book of
The Book
Esther when
Esther
their
plays
video's
such an
done.
important role for Christian Zionists, they've made multiple movies out of it.
He has convinced your husband to destroy all the Jews, including you.
Esther saves the Jews by using her persuasion with the king. Evangelicals who are very wrapped up in this kind of theology, because Persia is modern day Iran, they sort of contextualize this Bible story into foreign policies.
Incredible.
Could it be that President Trump right now has been sort of raised for such a time as this, just like Queen
CBN
Esther, to help
News.
save the Jewish people from an Iranian menace?
As a Christian, I certainly believe that's possible.
Ah.
I'm confident that the Lord is at work here.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Vice
Yeah,
President Mike
he's
Pence
under
both
investigation
identify
for
as
his
evangelical
shenanigans.
Christians, and both have enormous influence over American foreign policy. A
Mike
ProPublica
Pompeo is
investigation
American
found that
foreign
Pence routed
policy right now.
millions of dollars in foreign aid that had been earmarked for humanitarian projects in Iraq, diverting it towards Christian groups in the
Oh,
country.
yes.
When President Trump approved
So
the drone
much
strike
yes.
that killed Iran's top military commander in January 2020,
There he
it
goes.
was, according to the Washington Post, at Pompeo and Pence's urging.
Intriguing.
When President Trump moved the U.S. Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the move had more support from American evangelicals than American Jews.
The other news swirling around the embassy's move to Jerusalem is what it could signal as part of biblical prophecy.
Donald Trump recognized history.
We know you,
Like
drunken
King Cyrus
Janine.
before him, fulfilled the biblical prophecy.
That evangelical support isn't an accident. The Trump administration courts it. After the administration put out a peace plan that would have given Israel unprecedented control over Palestinian land, the Christian Broadcast Network interviewed Trump's ambassador to Israel.
You're talking about opening up the Bible, bringing it back to life in ways that I think your listeners could not have even have imagined. It's an opportunity for biblical tourism that I think will grow and flourish.
Yes, let's capitalize. Let's sell tickets to the Church of the Nativity.
Israel would have sovereignty over many historical.
Well, they got some more important sites that they could sell big tickets to if they had control over Jerusalem.
Oh, I mean, it's a great idea. All they have to do is turn the whole place into the Jesus Land theme park and make everything paid for premium events. So you pay extra to get into, the Dome of the Rock and the Church of the Nativity and the Mount Sinai itself. I mean, you can it never stops. You could monetize it infinitely. The kitsch, the tourism kitsch sells itself.
Yep.
It's a prophetic roadmap that tells the future and shapes the way they view the present. And for an influential group of them, that motivates their support for a foreign policy that they see as affirming those prophecies, and a president who depends on their votes.
Oh my, how fascinating indeed. The American evangelicals are letting biblical prophecy guide their foreign policy and the way they relate to other nation states.
Yep. All based, again, on that same way I was talking about reading the Bible earlier, where you read it as if it's happening today, as opposed to it happening when it was written. So imagine with me, Nexus, so this podcast being recorded in the middle of a global pandemic.
Yes.
If somebody watches, listens to, somehow absorbs this podcast, let's say 2,000 years from now.
Yeah.
And they happen to be going through, a global pandemic. And let's say their global pandemic is bloodborne instead of airborne like ours is. And so I've said, wear a mask, you'll love your neighbor.
Our entire mask conversation becomes completely open to misinterpretation.
Yes. And so what they're hearing is, these people, in this line of tradition that somehow we've concocted this, but for our sake of our argument, people will care about us and use us as authority 2,000 years from now. And so now they're all religiously, pun intended, wearing masks because that's how the last global pandemic was fought. That they're reading from this authority.
Yes. This is incredible. This.
So imagine reading the Bible. Imagine reading the Bible in that same fashion. So you read a book like Revelation, which is a vision of what the end of the world will look like.
One possibly influenced by hallucinogens, from what I'm told.
The way that it presents itself, and that's if you just read the text, that it is a dream sequence of the author of Revelation being shown visions, metaphorically visions, of what the end goal of God and the world is.
Wow.
And if you read it from that angle, then you can see why people are talking about the end of the world, not, as the video describes, a roadmap on how to get to the end of the world as fast as possible. Do you see that? Do you hear the difference? Am I
absolutely
clarifying that?
Absolutely.
Okay. And so what the unintended consequence of that biblical interpretation is that the Christian apocalypse, as it is viewed by white evangelicals, cannot occur until there is a state of Israel. Because in Revelation, it says Jerusalem will be destroyed, or has been destroyed and will be restored before Jesus comes back.
So the narrative that I hear from certain very, let's just say, loud and aggressive sections of the left relating to the likelihood of a apocalyptic world-ending war of revelation that brings about the four horsemen. Are these foreign policies engineered to bring that apocalypse forward?
Yes, because the white evangelicals reading Revelation want the apocalypse to happen because in that story, they are the winners.
Ah.
So you can root for a destructive end of the world as long as you are on the side of the hero.
You're on the winning team.
So because again, I'm using their language here.
Of course.
Because God has given us a roadmap that tells us which side to be on.
Yes.
We picked the winning side, and we just have to make the world look like that now.
So troubling.
Danger
and
that then gets you. Yeah. So then that gets you to where you read a book like Revelation that requires there be a Jerusalem under Jewish power, which is what we saw. And then you read a book like Esther that shows what an edict against the Jews would look like from the Empire of Persia, which happens to coincide with one of our actual enemies today.
Yes.
Or at least, Iran is not just a problem because they're part of Persia. Like there's history there that I'm probably not able to piece all the way together. But
just in case
it's a convenient choice.
Just in case any Iranians are listening, the two speakers on this show, I don't think either one of us have any animus towards you, your country, or your people.
Oh no, absolutely not.
The foreign policy aims of the United States and their actions taken abroad are, because of the nature of the Trump administration, entirely divorced from most of us as regular American citizens and reality, frankly. The Trump's decisions, in my opinion, their decisions are based entirely on some imagined version of the world that we don't actually live in. Honestly, there are times I wish I could see the world as black and white as they do, but then I'd probably have my head in the sand.
And I think that, and I'm, as we said at the beginning of the show, I'm a progressive Christian, so I am explaining the rational reasons that they could come to these opinions, not accounting for, that they don't have to be rational at any moment in time. But if they are being rational, here's at least the history that gets you to that rational thought.
And that makes perfect sense, because I believe that a rational reading of the teachings of Jesus are not going to lead someone to embrace greed, self-interest, and pursuit of financial, gains and stability at the cost of morals in the end. I know I said I wasn't going to talk about prosperity gospel preachers, but I have to at least sideways mention them because they practice that special form of Christianity that dictates that they are wealthy and successful and have 20 Ferraris, a McLaren, and 2 private jets because that's what God wanted them to have. That if you are poor, it's because God wants you to be poor. I've had this argument with lots of folks and a few conservatives in Discord servers I share with, one of whom actually articulated this position in so many words, where he said, if you are poor, it is because God thinks you deserve it.
Yeah, I mean, that the idea that capitalism and moral virtue are somehow linked with each other. That's a scary concept to me. And it very much starts to break down when you start to examine how you're rewarded in a capitalist system.
Amazing.
And so, if you are rewarded for being good and punished for being bad, if that was a true instance for every living human being on this planet, then maybe I'd hear that argument.
A truly just and meritocratic world that exists inside of a vacuum, essentially.
Yes. But when you look at not only the teachings of Jesus Christ, and you look at the charity work that Christians are called to do, you start to realize that the humanity in that does not follow those rules.
It definitely doesn't seem to me.
Yeah. And so, if I can, if I go on a mission trip, or go volunteer at my local soup kitchen, or pick a good deed to do, and imagine that with me.
Yeah.
And I meet a person who is the one holding the door open for everybody, but me being in there, if I don't want to hold the door open for everybody, like, am I no longer the one there doing the good service? And so when you meet these people and you hear their stories and you find out that, the troubles they're in are not of their own, they've either had economic misfortune, which happens for many number of reasons that are out of our control and are out,
especially now. Especially
chaos.
Yes, especially now, thanks to coronavirus. Coronavirus is enhancing the rate at which jobs are accelerating their automation and eventual takeover by artificial intelligent algorithms.
Yeah. What coronavirus is showing us, at least especially in some of the places that are fighting it from a president who doesn't think it's existed, even though he has had it. Which, just the fact that sentence came out of my mouth literally pains me.
Me too, boss.
That you can literally be faced with it, and I have been, as adjacent to real life coronavirus as you can get. So I know that I've literally looked it in the face, kind of thing. So the fact that he got closer to it than that and still thinks it's a hoax, I don't want to be inside that head. Let me just say that.
Well, since we're on the subject of coronavirus, and I think it's worth mentioning, we were talking with your lovely wife in the green room about the experiences that progressive Christians are having in ministering to the sufferers, the folks who are victims of this plague. Do you have any relevant experiences that you might like to share? Obviously respecting the confidentiality of anyone involved. I
absolutely. I mean, I would say that that's my tangent that I have been close enough to, is that
have at it.
My
boss.
wife is very close to that, and so watching someone, and I'm gonna speak in the hypothetical, but know that what I'm telling you is based on real events. Okay?
Yes, we're gonna do a David Simon scene.
Yes. So imagine a loved one is in the hospital with coronavirus, and it is turning to be a fatal.
It's going from bad to worse.
Yes. And so not only, especially in the beginning, not only did you have to do that by yourself, your family is notified over the telephone.
Oh.
Because they're,
Yeah, the drama.
Because you aren't allowed a visitor. So now you're going through a grieving process, which for my money is the hardest thing any human has to do is grief.
Yes.
We do not do it well. and rightfully so. It's not something that we should ever get used to.
Agreed.
And so, in the training that my wife and I have, in our master's degrees of divinity, is learning how to walk with people while they're grieving. And a lot of the techniques, and I'm using that word lightly because it you have to be taught it, but it's a human interaction thing, so I don't want it to sound too technical.
Well, yeah, you're going to feel empathy for these people, but at the same time, you do have to maintain an appropriate both physically, social, and emotional distance, because you have to obviously take care of yourself, and your wife has to take care of herself as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so compounding that grief with then the shock realization that, that how that person got coronavirus then sets in survivor's guilt
among the family.
To explain survivor's guilt, just for anyone out there. So imagine you're driving a car drunk and you kill your passenger in a drunk driving accident. You will then grieve that it is your fault that that person died. And that is an emotional human response that you will have, whether it's through denial or whatever, but you will feel that, what we call survivor's guilt.
And the personal responsibility folks in the crowd would say that you are right to feel it because your drunkenness resulted in the negligent death of a person.
Yes, and I specifically chose drunk driving to illustrate that point, because now I got another one for you.
Okay.
So we have I'm gonna shock the crowd here. We have a 27-year-old woman is dying of coronavirus.
27 years old.
Yes. And again, this is a theoretical based on true events.
Yep.
So if the comment section starts saying no one under 65 dies of coronavirus, I'm here to tell you
they don't
that
believe
is
in
not true.
coronavirus, and they're a COVID denier, and as far as I'm concerned, they can eat my you-know-what. Please continue.
All right. Okay, so setting the scene for you, we have this young woman who's dying of coronavirus. Let's say her
hold on. Say your last again.
Boyfriend,
I had a minor lag spike. I apologize.
Oh, you're fine. Where was I when you lag spiked?
You were saying the young woman, 27 years old, she. Yeah.
Okay, so we have a she.
Yeah.
And we have her boyfriend, so they are not legally married. That is going to come in very crucially here in a second.
Gotcha.
So her boyfriend, let's say he was at a house party, let's say April the 6th.
Okay.
Because that's early enough that things had started to open back up, but not late enough that we had, all gotten used to wearing masks or whatever.
And you're in deep red Make America Great country, just so I'm clear.
I am in the...
You don't have to say what state, but
yes.
That's why I asked. So you're in a deep red Republican territory.
I am in a small blue dot in a big red land.
Gotcha. Please continue.
How about
boss.
that?
That's perfect.
All right. And so that scenario has happened. So in theory, this boyfriend has now brought coronavirus to this young woman.
Because he attended this April party.
One of those, hooray, we're out of 2 weeks of quarantine parties. One of those.
There were many.
Yes. And so now that gentleman is now watching his girlfriend, who we're going to assume in this scenario he loves very deeply and they would have gotten married.
Absolutely.
Kind of thing. The reason they are not married is because then we have to answer the next of kin question. Because that boyfriend does not have any current legal rights inside the hospital.
Correct.
To that woman. So not only can you not see them because it's hospital policy, if the hospital is accepting next of kins to, identify or make legal decisions.
Or even pay last respects, maybe a final quick visit.
So you have all of that going, and then you have, let's say, her parents are out of town, or this woman doesn't have family in the same area that she is currently in the hospital.
Yes.
So they are frantically now having to decide, do we risk our lives to get on an airplane to go to a place where we're not going to be able to visit? We are literally not, we're going to be able to stand on the sidewalk outside of the hospital, and that's the closest we're going to get. And so it's in that circle that then people like my wife, who is a hospital chaplain,
comes into the story.
Responsibility is to be the voice for not only that patient, but for that boyfriend and for that family in a spiritual setting.
Yes.
But if that family is not religious, she can also help them in a humanist standpoint as well. So it doesn't take on a religious overtone if it doesn't need to.
At which point she's essentially just a counselor for any and everyone who's
and I mean, sometimes it's even just being, a person to, especially in the pre-COVID times, it's somebody to sit with you. I can attest to the power of just having an advocate sit next to you and be in an uncomfortable space with you.
Yep.
And as ministers, because we're both ministers, I am in a church ordained setting, and she's in a so the privilege of getting to sit in that moment is one that we don't take lightly. And it's not, it's like a firefighter running into a burning building. Like, not everybody should do it, but those who are capable of doing it should do it.
It is service.
Yeah. And so, but a lot of sitting with somebody in that moment is having the and I say physical, as sitting next to, or, hearing the voice not through a computer or a telephone. And so that's one of the things that in the coronavirus that gets lost in that service is not only
contact,
is that the human contact in that moment that,
that has that healing effect.
Yeah. Yeah. And so to combat the apparent hoax of coronavirus after having experienced that is daunting enough. Because now you're saying that what I have physically seen with my own eyes is less truthful than something you've heard.
And that brings us to the battle of information, the true front of what I believe is the currently ongoing World War III. It is not actually happening with guns, with weapons, with missiles. It's happening with memes and images and stories on Twitter, where people will say, for example, a man walks into my union shop and tells me, I just got done sleeping with a Florida lady who knows all the truckers from here to Miami, and she said ain't none of the long-haul truckers got COVID, so that means COVID ain't real. I'm just going to let that sink in for a second, because that's a special level of insanity. Oh. I don't even know how to respond to those things when people walk into the shop and say them. When people walk in and say that kind of crazy.
Yeah. And I like to, and one of the ways that I have come to a progressive understanding of Christianity is through trying to empathize with other people.
Absolutely.
I think that's the silver bullet in religion, a religious medium, is that if we try to answer with love and empathy, then we will get answers that are closer to our human design.
And that brings us closer to the true revelation that Democrats and Republicans are not enemies in a time of war. They are opposing political parties that seek to govern a nation. We need, in our partisanship, to stop using the rhetoric of war, for it divides us further from the truth that we are all citizens. We all still live here together. We share the same roads, the same restaurants, the same currency. It truly befuddles me. It really does. Well, we are approaching the hour mark. I should offer you the opportunity. Do you have any messages, shout-outs, or advice for anyone listening in coping with the interesting times that we live in today?
All right. So, kind of put a rubber stamp on it.
Yes, sir.
Mostly, I would say don't brush with big strokes. Know that there are spectrums of everything. And the sooner that we get out of black and white and get into gray,
the better we can make
but
our
also
country.
Yes. And then also to those that have been harmed by Christianity, I want to say I'm sorry. Just that there are spaces for people who have been harmed by the church, and that a community of people is out there. And if that is something that you seek, there are ways to find that.
What I'm hearing is reach out.
Yes. Mostly, especially from a progressive Christianity standpoint, we don't reach out well. We are more like even in this statement that I'm saying, I'm resisting the urge to say, we're here for you. We can be that last step. And that's not what I want to say. But I do know of stories of people who have been harmed by the church, that they find a church that, is more open to their lifestyle or what have you, that is a transformation form that helps them to have that empathetic, loving heart that they were not shown when they were inside the church. And I just want, if that is something they are seeking, that it is worth a shot. And there are plenty of ways to find ones that are
in your
friendly
local area
to the situation. Yes.
Do you know, would you be able to recommend a platform, perhaps maybe Facebook, where people could reach out to talk to folks?
Facebook's a good one. You can search any of your normal, if you do a LGBTQ friendly Google search, there are we haven't quite gotten to where there's a database of them yet, but there are enough keywords that from what I understand, that LGBTQ friendly verbiage is on their website front and center, so that people know that they are safe there.
Excellent. Preacher Man 9000, thank you so much for joining us today on the Bottom Shelf. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you about this stuff, and I really hope we'll see you here again, because there's so much more that we could talk about. I really feel like we've only scratched the surface here.
I was going to say, have me back after November 8th, and we'll talk some some more pleasant scenarios.
Absolutely. I will certainly work on getting that to happen, boss. Everyone out there listening who made it this far, thank you so very much. We value very much your time and listening to us. If you enjoyed what you heard, please drop us a like. Let us know in the comments section if you have any thoughts. And feel free to use the time link feature on YouTube to argue with any particular points. And I and maybe Preacher Man himself might show up in the comments section and chat with you about it. Ladies and gentlemen, my name has been Irreverent Nexus. Stay curious, friends.